When a cocky attorney and a condescending judge cross paths with Caroline Leavitt, a young and underestimated lawyer, they're convinced the courtroom battle ahead will be nothing more than an effortless victory. But what happens when Caroline unveils the full extent of her meticulous preparation, turning the tides in the most unexpected ways? The heavy oak doors of courtroom 3C creaked open as Caroline Leavitt stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the polished wooden floor. The scent of old books and varnished wood panels filled the air, mingling with the whispers of spectators seated in the gallery. The courtroom was alive with tension, the shuffle of papers, the creak of chairs as people adjusted their seats, and the occasional smirk thrown Caroline's way by those who had already judged her as out of her depth. She walked toward the defense table with confidence, clutching her case files tightly against her side. Her tailored navy suit was crisp, her posture impeccable, but it was clear that her youth and relative inexperience were already being scrutinized. Caroline's client, David Morales, sat beside her, an exhausted factory worker who had refused to compromise his ethics, only to be punished with termination. His hunched shoulders and tired eyes were evidence of the toll this fight had taken on him, but Caroline was determined to prove that justice could prevail. At the plaintiff's table sat Richard Calloway, a veteran attorney with a reputation for flair and theatrics. His smirk widened as Caroline entered, his eyes glinting with the glee of someone who underestimated his opponent. Adjusting his expensive watch and smoothing the lapels of his tailored suit, he looked every bit the part of the seasoned professional. His exaggerated gestures as he conversed with his assistant made it clear he was already rehearsing his victory speech in his mind. But the centerpiece of the courtroom was Judge Henry Grayson. Seated high on the bench, he radiated an aura of authority tinged with condescension. His silver hair and sharp glasses gave him an academic air, but his reputation as a dismissive and impatient figure preceded him. Grayson leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel lightly against the wood as he regarded Caroline with a raised eyebrow. "Well," Grayson drawled, his tone thick with skepticism, "it seems we have a new face among us. Ms. Leavitt, is it? I take it you're fresh out of law school." The gallery chuckled softly, and Calloway let out a low laugh as he adjusted his tie. Caroline's cheeks warmed slightly, but she didn't flinch. She met Grayson's gaze with calm determination. "Yes, Your Honor," she said smoothly. "My name is Caroline Leavitt, and I am here representing Mr. Morales in his unlawful termination case." Grayson's lips twitched with amusement as he leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Unlawful termination, you say? Let me give you some advice, Ms. Leavitt. In this courtroom, we deal in law, not fairy tales. I trust you'll spare us any youthful idealism." Another wave of chuckles rippled through the gallery, and Calloway shook his head in mock disbelief. "Well said, Your Honor." Caroline remained composed, her voice steady as she replied, "Thank you for the advice, Your Honor. I assure you, my arguments will be rooted in both fact and precedent." Grayson waved a dismissive hand. "Proceed, then. Let's see if you can keep up." Caroline walked to the center of the courtroom, her heels echoing softly as she stood before the jury. The wood-paneled walls seemed to close in around her, the weight of judgment from both Grayson and Calloway palpable. But she stood tall, her voice clear and unwavering. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began. "This case is about integrity. It is about standing firm in the face of pressure to do wrong and the consequences that follow. My client, David Morales, was fired not because he failed to perform his duties, but because he refused to falsify safety reports, a directive that would have endangered lives." The gallery fell silent, the chuckles fading as the gravity of her statement settled over the room. Caroline continued, her tone measured but firm. "We will present evidence that proves Mr. Morales was coerced into unethical actions, and when he refused, his employer retaliated by terminating him unlawfully. This case is not only about Mr. Morales. It is about protecting the rights of every worker who chooses to stand up for what is right." Grayson cleared his throat loudly, cutting her off. "Ms. Leavitt, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Stick to the facts, if you please." Caroline inclined her head slightly, her expression calm but resolute. "Of course, Your Honor." and the facts will speak for themselves. She returned to her seat, her heart steady despite the palpable tension in the room. Calloway rose next, his theatrical movements and polished delivery commanding the jury's attention. He spoke of business necessity and lawful discretion, painting the employer as the victim in the scenario. His gestures were exaggerated, his confidence almost smug. But Caroline waited patiently, her hands resting lightly on her case files. She had heard it all before, and she knew her strategy was airtight. Calloway and Grayson might underestimate her, but she had prepared meticulously, and she was ready to dismantle their arguments one by one. Richard Calloway adjusted his cuffs as he strode to the center of the courtroom, projecting the confidence of someone who believed himself untouchable. He turned to face the jury with a practiced grin, his voice oozing with a rehearsed charm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Calloway began, spreading his arms in a theatrical gesture. "What we have here is a simple matter of business operations. Companies make decisions every day to ensure their efficiency and profitability. Mr. Morales, while perhaps well-meaning, made choices that conflicted with the best interests of his employer." He turned slightly, directing his next comment to Judge Grayson, who nodded along with a bemused expression. "Now, I'm not one to question someone's personal ethics," Calloway continued, "but let's not lose sight of what's at stake here. A company's right to protect itself from disruptive employees." Caroline Leavitt sat quietly at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She knew better than to react to Calloway's condescension. Instead, she listened carefully, noting every flaw in his argument and every overreach in his delivery. Theatrics might dazzle an audience, but facts won cases. Calloway went on, his voice rising slightly for effect. "The plaintiff's claims are nothing more than an attempt to undermine lawful business practices. Let's not allow emotions or idealistic notions of workplace utopia to distract us from the truth. The termination was justified, and I trust you'll see that when the facts are presented." He ended with a dramatic pause, flashing another smile at the jury before returning to his seat. Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, and glanced at Caroline. "Well, Ms. Leavitt," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "I hope you took notes. That's how you deliver an opening argument." The gallery chuckled softly, and Calloway smirked in Caroline's direction. But she didn't flinch. She rose calmly, gathering her notes, and walked to the center of the courtroom with a confidence that made the gallery fall silent. "Your Honor, members of the jury," Caroline began, her voice clear and measured, "Mr. Calloway's argument rests on one critical assumption, that my client was a disruptive employee, but the evidence will show that this assumption is not only false but also deliberately misleading." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Calloway's smirk faded ever so slightly. Caroline continued, her tone steady and precise. "The evidence will demonstrate that Mr. Morales was terminated not because he disrupted his workplace, but because he refused to falsify safety reports, an action that would have endangered countless lives." Caroline turned to the jury, meeting their eyes with quiet conviction. "We will present documentation that directly contradicts the defendant's claims. You will see emails from Mr. Morales' supervisors threatening him with termination if he didn't comply. You will hear testimony from co-workers who witnessed these threats. And you will see how these actions violate not only ethical standards, but also the Whistleblower Protection Act." Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, raising an eyebrow. "Whistleblower Protection Act, you say? That's quite a reach for such a simple case, don't you think?" "With all due respect, Your Honor," Caroline replied without missing a beat, "the application of federal law is not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of fact, and the facts support my client." Grayson blinked, momentarily caught off guard by her calm rebuttal. The gallery murmured softly, a subtle shift in energy signaling that Caroline was beginning to command the room. She turned to Calloway, who was scribbling notes furiously, his earlier theatrics now tempered by a hint of unease. "Mr. Calloway may claim that this is a straightforward case of business necessity," Caroline said, her voice rising slightly. "But the truth is far more complex, and as we present our evidence, I trust you will see that my client's actions were not only justified but also protected by law. Caroline returned to her seat, her heart steady despite the tension crackling in the air. Grayson tapped his gavel lightly, his expression unreadable. We'll see if the facts are as compelling as you claim, Ms. Leavitt, he said. But don't get ahead of yourself. The courtroom is no place for rookie overconfidence. Another wave of chuckles rippled through the gallery, and Calloway regained his smirk, muttering something under his breath. But Caroline wasn't fazed. She had set the stage, and she knew the strength of her case. Now it was time to let the evidence do the talking. The courtroom air felt thick with tension as Caroline Leavitt prepared to present her evidence. Calloway sat across from her, his smirk faltering ever so slightly as he saw the neatly organized stacks of documents and the calm determination on her face. He hadn't expected her to press forward so confidently after the jibes from Judge Grayson and his own theatrical opening. But Caroline wasn't here to put on a show. She was here to win. Your Honor, Caroline said as she stood, her voice steady and professional. I would like to call attention to Exhibit A, email correspondence between Mr. Morales and his former supervisor. She approached the court clerk, handing over a printed set of emails, which were then distributed to the jury and placed before Grayson. The judge glanced at the documents, raising an eyebrow. And what is it that we're supposed to see here, Ms. Leavitt? These emails, Your Honor, Caroline began, demonstrate clear evidence of coercion. In them, Mr. Morales' supervisor explicitly threatens him with termination if he refuses to falsify safety reports. I direct your attention to the second email, dated March 15th, where the language becomes particularly aggressive. As Grayson read through the document, his expression shifted slightly, though he said nothing. Meanwhile, Calloway leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he scanned the papers in front of him. The once confident attorney now seemed slightly less assured. Caroline continued, addressing the jury. This correspondence not only shows the pressure placed on Mr. Morales, but also illustrates his firm refusal to compromise his ethics. He repeatedly informed his supervisor that falsifying reports would violate both company policy and federal safety regulations. Rather than addressing these concerns, the company chose to retaliate against him. Calloway stood abruptly, clearing his throat. Objection, Your Honor, he said, his voice louder than necessary. This is speculative. There's no proof that these emails represent company-wide directives. Grayson looked up, his gaze shifting between Calloway and Caroline. Ms. Leavitt, care to respond? Caroline nodded, her expression calm. Yes, Your Honor. In addition to these emails, we have testimony from multiple co-workers who were aware of the supervisor's demands. These witnesses will corroborate that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of unethical behavior encouraged by the company. The judge considered this for a moment before gesturing for her to continue. Proceed. Calloway sank back into his seat, his jaw tightening. Caroline could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to regroup, but she wasn't about to let up. I'd also like to present Exhibit B, she announced, retrieving another document from her files. This is an official report from the Department of Labor inspector who conducted an investigation into the company shortly after Mr. Morales' termination. The report highlights numerous violations of federal safety standards, many of which align with the concerns raised by my client. The gallery murmured softly as the document was passed around. Grayson leaned forward, his interest visibly piqued despite himself. An official report, you say? Why wasn't this presented earlier, Mr. Calloway? Calloway's face reddened slightly as he stumbled over his words. Your Honor, the report is tangential at best. It doesn't directly pertain to the circumstances of Mr. Morales' termination. Caroline interjected smoothly. On the contrary, Your Honor, this report provides critical context. It demonstrates that the safety concerns raised by Mr. Morales were valid, and that his refusal to falsify reports was an act of integrity, not insubordination. Grayson adjusted his glasses, studying the report intently. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the evidence pressing down on everyone present. Calloway shuffled his papers nervously, his earlier bravado nowhere to be seen. Caroline turned to face the jury, her voice unwavering. The evidence is clear. My client was terminated not because he failed to perform his job, but because he refused to compromise his ethics. This is not just a case of wrongful termination. It is a case of retaliation against an employee who did the right thing. She returned to her seat, her heart steady as she observed the shifting energy in the room. Calloway was visibly unsettled, his confidence shaken by the strength of her evidence. Even Grayson, who had been so dismissive earlier, now seemed more contemplative. The gallery sat in rapt attention, the whispers and chuckles from before replaced by a tense silence. Caroline knew she had struck a chord, but she also knew the battle was far from over. There was still much to prove, and she was ready for whatever came next. The courtroom was electric, the stillness heavy with anticipation as Caroline Leavitt prepared her next move. Richard Calloway, once smug and self-assured, now sat rigid in his chair, his jaw tightening as he tried to maintain his composure. Judge Henry Grayson, who had spent most of the hearing underestimating Caroline, leaned forward slightly, his previously dismissive demeanor replaced by quiet attentiveness. Caroline stood confidently, the energy in the room shifting as she spoke. Your Honor, members of the jury, I would now like to draw your attention to Preston versus Briarwood, a key precedent in cases involving ethical refusals in the workplace. She held up a neatly tabbed legal document and approached the bench, handing a copy to the clerk for distribution. Grayson adjusted his glasses, his brow furrowing as he scanned the text. Ah, Preston versus Briarwood, he muttered. A whistleblower case, if I'm not mistaken. Correct, Your Honor, Caroline said. In that case, the court ruled in favor of an employee who refused to engage in fraudulent activity, affirming that ethical refusal is a protected right under both company policy and federal law. The gallery murmured softly as Caroline continued, turning to the jury. The parallels between Preston versus Briarwood and Mr. Morales' case are undeniable. In both instances, employees were asked to compromise their integrity. When they refused, they faced retaliation. But the courts have made it clear, standing up for what is right cannot be punished without consequence. Calloway stood abruptly, clearing his throat. Your Honor, this is an attempt to draw false equivalencies. The circumstances in Preston are entirely different. Caroline cut him off, her tone calm but firm. Respectfully, Mr. Calloway, the circumstances are not different. In fact, they are strikingly similar. Like the plaintiff in Preston, Mr. Morales was asked to falsify critical reports. Like the plaintiff in Preston, he refused, citing both legal and ethical concerns. And just like the plaintiff in Preston, he was terminated as a result. She turned to the judge, her voice steady. Your Honor, the decision in Preston sets a clear precedent. Employers cannot retaliate against employees who act to uphold the law and protect public safety. Grayson tapped his gavel lightly, his expression thoughtful. Ms. Leavitt, your point is noted. Proceed. Caroline returned to her table, retrieving her final piece of evidence. Your Honor, I would now like to introduce Exhibit C, testimony from a former employee of the defendant company, who was also pressured to falsify reports but ultimately resigned rather than comply. The gallery buzzed with renewed interest as the document was submitted. Calloway shifted uncomfortably, the cracks in his confidence growing more apparent. He fumbled with his papers, glancing nervously at the jury, who were now fully engaged in Caroline's argument. Ms. Leavitt, Grayson said, his voice unusually neutral. This testimony is compelling, but I hope you're prepared to tie all of this together. Caroline nodded, her gaze unwavering. Absolutely, Your Honor. The testimony, the emails, the Department of Labor report, and the precedent set by Preston versus Briarwood all point to one undeniable truth. Mr. Morales was wrongfully terminated for doing the right thing. This is not just a matter of ethics, it is a matter of law. Grayson leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Calloway, meanwhile, scrambled to regain control. He stood, gesturing dramatically as he addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not lose sight of the bigger picture, Calloway said. his voice loud and strained. "This is a business decision, a necessary step to maintain order in the workplace. My client acted within their rights as an employer." Caroline remained seated, her composure unshaken. She let Calloway's theatrics play out, knowing that his desperation was on full display. When he finally finished, she rose calmly, turning once more to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and steady, "you've seen the evidence. You've heard the arguments. The law is on Mr. Morales' side. This is not about maintaining order, it's about protecting what is just and lawful. I trust you will see the truth." As she returned to her seat, the room felt charged with anticipation. Grayson glanced at Calloway, then back at Caroline, his expression pensive. The gallery was silent, every eye fixed on the young attorney who had managed to shift the momentum of the case. The tide was turning, and Caroline could feel it. The courtroom was silent as Judge Henry Grayson tapped his gavel lightly, signaling the final moments of the trial. All eyes were on him, waiting for his decision. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of Caroline Leavitt's arguments hanging heavily in the air. Richard Calloway sat stiffly in his seat, his earlier confidence shattered, his face pale and drawn. Caroline, by contrast, sat with quiet composure, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. She had done everything in her power to make her case airtight, and now the moment of truth had arrived. Grayson adjusted his glasses, his expression inscrutable as he looked over the evidence one last time. Finally, he leaned forward, addressing the courtroom. "This case," he began, his voice carrying authority, "has been both contentious and illuminating. At its core, it raises important questions about the balance between business interests and the rights of employees to uphold their ethical and legal obligations." Caroline's heart pounded, but her face betrayed no emotion. She glanced briefly at her client, David Morales, who sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly together. He seemed to be holding his breath. Grayson continued, turning his gaze toward the jury. "The evidence presented by Ms. Leavitt has been compelling. The email correspondence, the Department of Labor report, and the legal precedent cited have all painted a clear picture of retaliation against an employee who chose to prioritize integrity over compliance. Furthermore, the testimony from a former employee has corroborated these claims, leaving little room for doubt." Calloway shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand tightening around the edge of the table. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but Grayson raised a hand to silence him. "I must admit," the judge said, his tone softening slightly, "when this trial began, I was skeptical of Ms. Leavitt's ability to navigate such a complex case. I underestimated her, and I was wrong to do so." The gallery stirred, a few murmurs of surprise rippling through the audience. Grayson leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady as he addressed Caroline directly. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, his voice firm but respectful, "you have demonstrated exceptional skill and preparation in presenting this case. Your arguments were precise, your evidence thorough, and your understanding of the law commendable. You have proven yourself to be a formidable advocate." Caroline's breath caught in her throat, but she maintained her composure, offering a respectful nod in response. The gallery erupted into applause, the sound filling the room as the jury and spectators acknowledged her remarkable performance. Grayson raised his gavel again, waiting for the noise to subside. "In light of the evidence and arguments presented, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. David Morales. The termination of his employment was indeed unlawful, and the defendant company is hereby ordered to compensate him for lost wages and damages." The applause grew louder, the sound echoing off the wood-paneled walls. David Morales let out a shaky breath, a mixture of relief and gratitude washing over his face. He turned to Caroline, his eyes shining with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with feeling. "I don't know how to thank you enough." Caroline placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to," she replied softly. "You stood up for what was right. I just helped make sure your voice was heard." As the courtroom began to clear, Caroline gathered her files, her mind already replaying the events of the trial. She had faced condescension, skepticism, and outright hostility, but she had refused to back down. Her preparation, her belief in her client, and her unwavering commitment to justice had carried her through. Judge Grayson stepped down from the bench, approaching her with an extended hand. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, his tone now genuinely warm. "I've seen many attorneys come through this courtroom, but few have impressed me the way you have today. Well done." "Thank you, Your Honor," Caroline replied, shaking his hand. "I appreciate your kind words." As she left the courtroom, the applause still ringing in her ears, Caroline stepped out into the crisp Boston air. She paused on the courthouse steps, looking out over the bustling city. The weight of the trial lifted from her shoulders, replaced by a deep sense of accomplishment. She allowed herself a moment to reflect. The path of an attorney was not an easy one, and there would always be skeptics and challenges ahead. But today had proven something vital, that with preparation, perseverance, and a steadfast belief in justice, even the most daunting battles could be won. A faint smile crossed her lips as she walked down the steps, the sun warming her face. This was only the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. The sunlight outside the courthouse was crisp and bright, but Caroline Leavitt paused on the steps, letting the gravity of the moment wash over her. The crowd from the courtroom had spilled onto the sidewalk, still murmuring with excitement about what they had witnessed. For Caroline, the applause, the validation from Judge Grayson, and even her client's heartfelt gratitude were still fresh in her mind. She allowed herself a brief smile, not out of pride but out of the realization that the principles she had defended were worth every ounce of effort. The enormity of what had just happened began to sink in. She had been underestimated by both a courtroom veteran and a presiding judge, dismissed as an inexperienced, naive attorney. Yet through preparation, resilience, and clarity of purpose, she had turned their doubts into her triumph. As she descended the courthouse steps, Caroline thought about everything it had taken to reach this point. The long nights of studying, the countless hours spent preparing her case, and the belief that justice, when paired with meticulous effort, would prevail. This case wasn't just about David Morales. It was a testament to the power of standing firm, even in the face of adversity and derision. She glanced back at the courthouse, her gaze momentarily lingering on the grand columns that had been a silent witness to so many battles for justice. Her heart swelled with determination, knowing that this was only the beginning of her journey. There would be more cases, more challenges, and undoubtedly more skeptics. But she had proven today that she could rise to the occasion, and she would do so again. Turning her attention back to the bustling Boston streets, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just a career, it was a calling to defend what was right, to give a voice to those who had been silenced, and to remind the world that preparation and principles were a formidable force. As she disappeared into the crowd, Caroline carried with her a quiet but unshakable resolve. The courtroom doors might have closed behind her, but her fight for justice was far from over. And for anyone who doubted her in the future, they would learn, as Judge Grayson and Richard Calloway had, that Caroline Leavitt was a name worth remembering. I hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment, sharing your thoughts about it. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new and equally exciting stories. See you in the next video.